Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session on the China Challenge. It's a fantastic panel we have for you today. And I guess what's particularly exciting about this panel is that very often China is sort of China in inverted commas. It's an idea, it's an avatar for what people feel about globalization or China's political system, as opposed to China, the country, the policy challenge. And we have three outstanding panelists who have spent many, many years in government and in academia studying the China that is the real place, the policy challenge, the place where things happen, where people live. And that's a really tremendous resource and very unusual in the kind of the larger China debate. So I'll be very brief in introducing because they're all, they don't need any introduction. Jim Baker on the far end there is a long time, was the head of the Office of Net Assessment, which is the most influential office at the Pentagon that many people have never heard of. A fantastic deeply secretive organization. Mike Froman, obviously former U.S. trade representative, now president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Liz Economy at Stanford University, formerly of the Council on Foreign Relations, and also worked directly on trade policy for Secretary Raimondo in the Biden administration. And I'm David Rennie. I'm a reporter from The Economist. I just finished 6 years as our Beijing bureau chief. I wrote a column about China. So I'm just the hired help. I'm the reporter on the side. So I think to try and make this a useful, real value-added conversation, given the expertise that we have here, we're going to spend some time talking about China, the country, really as a domestic question, and then looking at China and the world, and clearly, particularly, China and the US, arguably the most important bilateral relationship in the world. And so my starting point, I guess, to all of you, and I'll start with Liz, because you've written so much about Xi Jinping, your great books. Xi Jinping has a phrase that many of you will have heard about: by mid-century, by the centenary of the People's Republic of China in 2049, the idea is to have the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, that China will resume its rightful place at the very top table of global affairs. And I guess it's a very useful time to check in. How is that looking? Are they on track, given the headwinds, but also the strengths? How do you balance out the strengths and weaknesses of this rejuvenation project?
Yeah. Thanks, David. It's great to be here with you and Mike and Jim and be back at the Aspen Ideas Festival. So I think to do fairness to Xi Jinping, we should probably look at what he meant by the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And beginning from when he was first selected in 2012, I think he articulated sort of four priorities. You know, first was to have a Chinese Communist Party that was at the forefront of the political system that was robust. Right, because when he came to power, there were many competing people, many competing ideas, and the Communist Party had really lost its moral authority, its moral center. So part of, I think maybe the most important thing was really to address the corruption that was sort of rotting the party from the inside. Second was to have a PLA, a People's Liberation Army, that was capable of fighting and winning wars. So really developing the capabilities of the Chinese military. Third was a Chinese economy that was equal by 2049, that was advanced like the US, Germany, Japan. And then fourth was really just to have China be the leader in terms of innovation and technology. So if we were to look across all four of those things, I think Xi Jinping could fairly take a victory lap. I think he would look across all of them and say, I've accomplished a lot. That being said, I think there are a number of challenges that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party continue to face. So let me just tick off a couple of those. I think right off the bat, the corruption issue. He has failed, I would say, to address the rot within the Chinese Communist Party. So if you look just at the 2024 statistics, for example, there were almost 900,000 Chinese party officials who were detained or arrested or punished for some corruption or other kind of administrative malfeasance. Every year, that number goes back and forth between 500,000 and 1 million people. There is no systemic way of addressing corruption because there's no transparency, there's not a free media, there's not an impartial judiciary. It's all from the top down. So that affects China's reputation globally, that corruption, and it affects still, I think, the perception of the Chinese people about the Chinese Communist Party. That being said, I will say that he has succeeded in creating a robust Chinese Communist Party in the sense that it has penetrated Chinese society and the Chinese economy to a much greater extent than previously. I think another problem is certainly demographics. That's something that you hear a lot about in the press. You know, look, China by 2100 is likely to have half the population that it has today. More importantly, the population is aging, 300 million people over 60, although it's not so bad, right, Mike, being over 60? But anyway, no, that's me too. Let's be clear. That's me too. No.
Look, in this audience, that's an insult to everybody. So, welcome to the Aspen Ideas Festival.
True. In any case, over 60 by 2050. But let's be frank. Younger people are the source of innovation. They are generally the faster adopters of new technology, et cetera. And that part of China's working age population peaked in 2012. And so that's a significant challenge that China faces. A couple others, I think. We'll talk about the economy, I'm sure, so I won't go into greater depth, but there are many factors within the Chinese economy that are problematic. And I think one last one that I'll just highlight is inequality in China, because I think many people find this surprising. But despite the fact that, per capita GDP is now around 13,000 or 12,000, 13,000 US dollars. Basically, the 75% of the Chinese make under $3,000 a year. Right? 1% of Chinese command 30% of the wealth of the country. The top 10%, about 2/3 of the wealth. So China is, you can just take this away, China is as unequal a society as the United States. Many, many more challenges, but let me stop there.
That's right. And I think one of the fascinating things about being on the ground in China is it's not just inequality of classes and income, it's also a sense of temporal inequality, if that's a phrase, that there was a sense that there were times when if you got on the property ladder 15 years ago or you entered the job market at the right time, that there are opportunities. The ladders are just disappearing. I think that's one of the greatest sources of malaise in the population is the idea of there are just, Chinese use this phrase about 上车, catch the train, change your life. There are just fewer trains to catch, and that's a big thing. So we're going to talk specifically about the economy and trade in a minute and the military side of this. But just before we end this high-level, headwinds versus strengths, Jim and Mike, do you want to jump in on just, sometimes in Washington it feels like the debate is simultaneously panic and complacency. China's going to kind of become so strong they kill us all versus China is making so many mistakes that they're going to do us the favor of defeating themselves. In your role analyzing China, where did you come down on that line, Jim?
I think the long-term trends definitely favor the United States. In addition to the examples that Liz addressed, you have to imagine the United States, for example, in 2100 is going to be 4% of the world's population. Today, we're 4% of the world's population, whereas China will move from 18% to 6%. That means fewer minds, fewer people, fewer hands inventing novel things. The United States in 1980 was 25% of the world's GDP by market exchange rates, and today we're 25% of the world's exchange rates. China has slipped from being 75% of US GDP to less than 66%, even over the last 2 or 3 years. So I see more headwinds than China over the long term. I feel really good about the geopolitical neighborhood they have to live in compared to the one we have to live in, surrounded by powers that will challenge them over time, militarily, politically, diplomatically. Whatever you think of our current relationships with Canada and Mexico, longtime friends and good neighbors, by and large.
I was going to say shocking insouciance about the national security threat from Canada, but anyway, yes. we'll pass. So, Ambassador, just Mike, on that, sort of, Mike, on that, I'm sorry,
only
old habits,
only my
old habits
die hard to call me Your Excellency.
Old habits die hard.
Look, I just want to respond to something you said in your question. I think a few years ago, I think there was a balance or a schizophrenia between those who thought China was 12 feet tall and those who thought it was 2 feet tall. I think right now the vast majority of the consensus views China as a very significant threat, and I don't see many people being terribly complacent about it. I think that's actually a risk because there's a lot of groupthink where, and Liz has been a great counter example of raising questions about fundamental challenges in China. I think we tend to underplay those challenges in the policy realm in Washington, and instead really just focus on the threat or the challenge that they pose.
And do you think that's kind of sometimes an unhelpful binary that, if the choice is are they going to dominate key technologies of the future versus are they going to have a stagnant and less happy society, maybe both, right? It's entirely possible that both could be the solution. I'd love to start now on trade because both of you have worked so closely on trade policy in two different administrations. And it's actually something that I heard yesterday in one of the sessions where the WTO entry of China came up. Now, I was in China in 2001 when China entered. And it was presented yesterday, I don't want to caricature someone else's view, as this was all really about tariffs and market access, and that this mercantilist power was kind of stupidly and foolishly allowed into America's market. Now, where I was in China, and then talking to Chinese officials later in this recent gig, who had been involved very closely in WTO entry, for them it was so much more than just tariffs and market access. It was about willingly exposing Chinese companies to foreign competition to make them stronger and better, willingly sending Chinese students to American universities, even in the knowledge that some might stay and make new lives in America, and the certainty that WTO membership gave foreign investors, that they knew that they could invest with kind of predictability and certainty. What was your experience, both of you, in the trade realm? And then I'm going to ask all of you how America counts on those same counts of certainty and predictability and embracing competition. But let's look at the China piece first. Can I start with you, Mike?
Sure. So first, I think it is much broader than tariffs, and we've got to go back and just turn the clock back a little ways. Long before China was a member of the WTO, they were getting the same access to the U.S. market every year, because every year we would apply, we would vote for MFN status for China, and they got the same access that every other country got to the U.S. So they were already exporting to us. At the time, you know, with Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji laying out this reform plan, they very much viewed WTO accession as a way of forcing very difficult economic reform in their country, and they affirmatively used the accession process to do so. And we forget how much really quite gut-wrenching reform went on during that period, including making tens of millions of Chinese unemployed as they restructured some of the state-owned enterprises, and they viewed locking into the WTO as a way of ensuring that they would stay on this path of reform. And I think those of us who were on the other side of the table or listening to this and seeing this, I think we thought that they were inevitably on this path. That was certainly what they were conveying, and I think what we've learned since is that first with Hu Jintao and then very much with Xi Jinping, that path of reform didn't go as far, didn't go as fast, and wasn't as linear as many of us expected and were led to believe. And maybe that was overly optimistic on our part, but it wasn't based on Pollyannish sort of hope. It was based on the Chinese leadership laying out and taking very specific actions that indicated they wanted to reform in all the ways that you said. Expose Chinese enterprises to foreign competition, attract foreign investment, bring technology to China, go out and collect the best information they could possibly collect from sending their students out to American and other Western universities, and really modernize China's economy. And by the way, the China economy is fundamentally different now than it was in the late 90s. But what we've seen, and as Liz talked about, was very much a reassertion of the party, integration of the party back into the private sector, a chilling effect on foreign investment, and a lot of disappointment by non-Chinese firms who tried to do business in China and found that they were either having their IP stolen, that they were being very limited in their success, that as soon as they were successful, there was a Chinese competitor who was taking their IP and set up a factory across the road and now was squeezing them out of the market. And it was the losing of the opportunity in China that a lot of American and other companies faced that I think fundamentally changed the politics, because the business community had been, in many respects, the ballast in the relationship, the part of the relationship that said we need to engage, we need to continue talking. And what happened is when they lost interest and lost faith in their capacity to succeed in China or to compete with China elsewhere on a fair and level playing field, there was no ballast against those who had raised concerns on the military and the political side.
And Liz, you just worked in the Biden administration, and I guess the outside world's sort of view is that actually there was a remarkable continuity between Trump 1 and Biden, that, broadly WTO entry in 2001 for China had been a terrible mistake. Is that a fair characterization of where politics was when you were in government recently? And was that inevitable? Was, the disappointment that Mike talks about, were choices made by the Chinese that took us off a path that could have been benign, or do you sort of side with those who say it was always just a catastrophic error and we were always going to end up in this place?
I'm definitely not someone who believes that this was, the inevitable path of China. I think leaders make a huge difference in the country, and you can look back just to the pre-Xi Jinping period in 2010 and see, frankly, a radically different China in terms of what was transpiring in the economy and and politically, right? You had a very open internet. You had Chinese entrepreneurs sitting down with Chinese intellectuals and lawyers talking about political reform in China and further economic reform. It was a very different China, I think, in that immediate pre-Xi Jinping period. And I think he really, was an important inflection point. Not the only one. I mean, certain things happened, 2008, the global financial crisis. There were other moments that set China on a slightly different trajectory, but I think he really was the person that moved China off, I think, what we had as a set of expectations. I would just add, I think, Mike described, I think, the disillusionment of the U.S. business community quite well. I think a number of other factors played into the U.S. sort of retrenchment in terms of the focus that it put on the U.S.-China trade relationship. Number one, COVID, and sort of the new understanding of the importance of supply chains and the sense that we could not afford to be overly dependent on any one country for things that were critical to our, economic or national security or our human security. And it's not even just about China. We're concerned about Taiwan and overdependence on Taiwan for advanced semiconductors. I also think the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Which we're going to talk about in a minute.
Okay, but I won't go there. Don't worry. But Russian invasion of Ukraine was also important because you started to have boards of companies become concerned about the potential for, China and Taiwan. Watching what the administration did in terms of the sanctions. So what would be the impact on U.S. business if you had something similar happen in that space? So I think a lot of factors played in addition to the more challenging domestic environment in China for U.S. and other multinationals.
It felt like that whole question of interdependency suddenly pivoted, right? Interdependency is great right until it becomes frightening.
Right.
And then exactly the same ties suddenly feel like a terrible vulnerability. Jim, so you headed this office whose job was to think long-term pictures, long-term scenarios. You gave us a kind of rosy series of comparative numbers, how America is actually in better shape than we think. Just narrowly on the question of lessons, and if this is too political, let me know, but it feels like we're learning all the lessons at the moment. The wrong lessons is like China is protectionist, has subsidies and industrial policies. Let's be that. But couldn't America also learn from embracing competition and certainty and attracting foreign investment and educating kids? The Economist has a fantastic article this week, which I didn't write. I can praise it. 36% of Chinese undergraduates are studying engineering, 5% in the States. So that's something to think about, right? If you want to dominate certain sectors. What's your general view of, are we learning the right or wrong lessons from China?
The notion that we should somehow seek to emulate parts of the Chinese system is not sort of a novel idea. FDR was fascinated by Germany's policies in the 1930s and oftentimes tried to adopt some of those things because he saw the economy restarting and felt like some of those lessons could be applied. The danger is that we run the risk of forgetting who we really are and what we're really good at. Generally, we've never been that good at industrial policy, and we're learning, I'll say slowly, and inducing distortions in our economy along the way, oftentimes, as Dr. Economy suggested, for good reason, to reduce dependencies or to aid stockpilings or reduce supply chain dependencies. But your magazine in October of 2024 had a fascinating special edition on how the United States economy just continues to grow and basically kick the crap out of every other OECD country and most of the rest of the world. We are doing a lot of things right. We have this innovation ecosystem that disproportionately rewards entrepreneurships. We have very deep financial markets, 4 times the size of the next largest, that would be Europe. We still have world-class universities that attract talent. We'll see what the future holds there. So I would say we need to be very careful about lessons we draw from China. The one thing both states seem very eager to do is to run fiscal imbalances as far as the eye can see, to ever-diminishing effect. And that is severely crimping China's economic growth, probably 2 to 3% in real terms last year, probably less than that this year. And doesn't really yet seem to have exerted much gravitational pull on the United States.
And Jim, your punishment for calling The Economist a magazine, when obviously we're a newspaper, is to take a very specific question on China's military. You know, Xi Jinping says he wants a world-class military by mid-century or as soon as possible. How closely did they study exactly what America was doing? And is it right, this idea that they basically matched America sort of system for system? I thought the whole of their kind of modernization has been about this sort of America as the pacing threat in that kind of jargon.
China woke up to the threat the United States poses to the intervention in Taiwan in 1996 and have been studying the United States very closely ever since, and we've afforded them many opportunities to study us. They've learned basically three things, among many things, but basically three things. First, you need to prevent the United States from piling up iron anywhere near your shores. Second, you need to avoid building fixed infrastructure that the United States can readily target, as we just saw with the Iranian strikes. And third, you need to be ready to seize Taiwan very quickly if you can. The bad news is that China has made a lot of progress knocking down all three of those objectives. Right now, tens of thousands of missiles can range what they call the first island chain, where US forces are largely based in fixed above-ground places. Hundreds of missiles can range as far as Guam or even Hawaii. That's all going to impede the United States' ability to actually move forces near shore, and most of our forces still very short-ranged. They've moved a lot of their command and control underground, making it very difficult for the US military to find and to kill, and they put a lot of their rocket forces on wheels, moving them all around the country, complicating the targeting cycle for the United States military. And the last thing they've done is they've begun to build, or at least to practice, either quarantining or maybe trying an amphibious invasion. One of the hardest military maneuvers you can ever try to attempt across 100 miles of water. It's going to be dicey for Xi Jinping, and he cannot have a lot of confidence at this moment that he should attempt such a thing.
So thank you. You've teed up. So we're going to leave behind China kind of as China and look at China and the world, and particularly China and the US. And I guess an opening question, which is one that I got asked so much when I was covering China in Beijing, was what is the world order that China wants? And there were all kinds of kind of straw man arguments that would then be kind of added to that. You know, well, they don't seem so scary because they don't actually want, you know, what Mao wanted. They don't want everyone waving Xi Jinping thought books in the streets of Berkeley or whatever. But I'd like to, Mike, can I start with you and then Liz? What do you think?
Dr. Economy is my senior,
Oh
so
my God.
you know.
Don't call me doctor.
Are we still on the age thing? Is that still rankling?
Just by age.
I am
just by
about
age,
a half
yes.
a year older, I think.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Look, I think what's been interesting, and again, I defer actually to Liz. I'm sure she's got a better sense of this.
Probably.
Is we've never met before, by the way. Is that they've been, as Liz was laying out Xi Jinping's four objectives about what the rejuvenation of China meant, what was absent from that list was a new world order.
That's because it was domestic politics.
Okay,
that I was
there you
supposed
go.
to focus
No, I
on.
wasn't critical.
Very
I was more critical of
It
Xi
sounded like
Jinping.
it. It sounded
Was
like
that
okay.
was that I don't think we
thank
have a clear idea ourselves that they have a world order that they want to replace us with, and they say that they just want to continue to grow and participate in the existing world order, which they've benefited enormously from. I mean, there's no country that has benefited more from the open, rules-based, globalist system that the U.S. helped put in place after the Second World War than China, and the benign international environment that allowed them to export their way to the economic success that they have had. You know, back in the beginning of the Obama administration, when we were dealing with the global financial crisis, and we empowered the G20 to be the group through which to manage that. Part of that was because we wanted China to be at the table, to give China a more significant role and set of responsibilities for the global economy. And one thing you have to give China incredible credit for is they are very good, very disciplined at pursuing their national interests narrowly defined. China first. And I say narrowly defined because, of course, every country pursues their national interests first, but some countries have historically defined those national interests in an enlightened way, where we think there is value to global public goods that we all benefit from and are willing to make certain sacrifices or certain compromises to help provide those global public goods. Thus far, China has been able to avoid doing that. And as the U.S. pulls back and not only pulls back, but sort of begins to take apart elements of the global system, the global world order. What's going to be interesting is to what degree China has any interest in stepping in. We've created a great opportunity for them to step in our absence, a great void for them to exert influence. But whether they step in with a new model for a global order or simply continue to pursue their national interests narrowly defined with the discipline they've shown, I think remains to be seen.
It's a great question. I was just interviewing the Chinese ambassador in South Africa, and I said, America's just cancelled the bulk of the PEPFAR funding that certainly in South African townships where I was providing HIV antiretrovirals. And I said, so Ambassador, you're going to step up and pay for that stuff? And he's like, our tradition is not to have direct grants. And I was like, why? And it was like, blah, 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 because they're very comfortable criticizing and copying.
That's a perfect example. PEPFAR, incredibly successful program started by George W. Bush, created a fantastic goodwill for the United States across Africa, and not very expensive. And the Chinese could pick it up for $8 billion a year and completely displace our goodwill in that continent.
So Liz, it's Make China Great Again. It's China First, eerily familiar ideas. What is the world order part of that? How ambitious are they?
So I think they're very ambitious because I think actually that China's ambition is actually not just to create a space for it to have a larger voice on the international stage. I think it is actually a fundamental reordering of the world order. And it begins with China reclaiming all the territory that it believes is its sovereign territory, which if it manages to do that, both in terms of physical territory and maritime domain, China will be about 1.5 times the size that it is currently. It wants the United States out as the dominant power in the Asia-Pacific. It wants Chinese, has as I mentioned, China to be the dominant technological and economic power that has many different ramifications for the kinds of policies made in China 2025. It's dual circulation policy, which is a very different relationship between China and the global economy, basically saying that China will insulate itself from the pressures of the global economy, but the global economy will continue to remain dependent on China and have multinationals remain dependent on China for parts of their supply chains because China believes it will give China political leverage over the countries. It has the Belt and Road Initiative. It wants to transform international norms and institutions. So let me just quickly tick off the most important ways. First of all, in human rights and internet governance, China has a vision of state-directed human rights, not universal human rights, where every state determines for the people within that state the human rights that they are granted. Very different from the current international system. It has de-dollarization. Right? China has been pushing this for more than a decade now. We haven't paid much attention to it, but now all of a sudden it's gaining a lot. The process is accelerating because China got a lot smarter. It stopped talking simply about renminbi internationalization, and it started talking about why shouldn't all countries be able to use their own currencies, right? Why should the dollar be the dominant currency? And we're contributing to that pace in a number of different ways. I won't go into that. And then on the security front, China has long called for the dissolution of the U.S.-led alliance system. It says it's anachronistic, a relic of the Cold War, targeted against China. Here, too, maybe things that President Trump is doing will accelerate that process. And it believes in indivisible security, the notion that a country has the right to take preemptive military action if it believes that its security is being threatened, which is what Russia used to justify its invasion of Ukraine. And you could easily imagine China using that to do something against Taiwan. So in many different respects, China has a vision of the international system that is radically different from the one that currently holds. Whether China steps up to supplant the United States, I think, is a different issue. They failed in 2017 in the first Trump administration, and I would say they've proved surprisingly ineffectual to date. So anyway, okay.
Jim, you headed this office that's their whole world is trying to work out kind of long-range assessments. What was your assessment of China's ambitions?
Very much in accordance with Liz's. I think we were very early to worry about China as a potential competitor to the United States. We started extensive research on that question back in 1999, and while the rest of the Pentagon was fighting the wars on terror globally, we were doing a lot of basic research on China. And it's true they don't really know what they want to be, but my own sense is that generally states, as they grow powerful, tend to export externally what their domestic context demands internally. The United States is an empire by invitation, an accidental empire, and was one of the most isolationist states philosophically in the world, and yet we've tried this. And what do we export? We export the idea, as Mike mentioned, we export the idea of free trade. We export the idea of human rights. We export the idea of state sovereignty, of people finding their own way. What will China export if we don't compete? You know, no one in this room had to check an app and confirm that you were reading Xi Jinping thought. Nobody in this room wonders if the person sitting next to them, who you've never met, is going to tell the government about something you've said. This panel, with implicit critique of the current administration and past administrations, doesn't exist in Beijing. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government for redress. Aspen, America, does not exist in the Chinese order, I believe.
Can I ask,
please, yeah.
You know, Jim, though, everything that you just ticked off that we export, would you maybe agree is under threat right now? We are not exporting democracy. We've taken it off the State Department's website for protection of free and fair elections and freedom of speech. We're no longer in that business. We certainly, I don't know, Mike, wouldn't call ourselves the, biggest advocate for free trade out there. I'm just wondering whether, I agree with you up until this point.
Well, 5 months, 8 months is not 80 years. We need to be and acknowledge our better self. We don't need to be our best self. We just need to be our better self.
I mean, I think it's interesting. We're sort of in the same position. I don't think the Trump administration knows what the new world order is going to look like. We know what the old elements of the old order that we want to dismantle looks like, but I don't think they've put forward a new vision of what it looks like, other than every country acting for itself. Similar on China, as Liz said, on a number of critical elements, they differ from the old order, but they're not necessarily stepping up with a new order to put in its place.
In fact, I think there's a fascinating parallel, right? That, I'm party pre because I wrote this as a cover story for The Economist, that what China wants is just the
right?
current...
It's a newspaper.
That's right, yeah, that's right. The China wants the current world order to just do a lot less, like half. So the post-45 order was basically a tension between state sovereignty, deference to states, and inalienable rights for individuals. And China's like, well, we'll take the states bit, and the individuals goes away. The challenge for them right now is that you saw Donald Trump in, say, the Gulf, in Riyadh, that speech where he said how dumb it was for America to pursue democracy promotion, to do regime change, that everything should be about trade, that economic prosperity is what cures all ills in a place like the Middle East. I can find you Xi Jinping speeches where he said exactly the same. Exactly. So the fascinating moment we're at is that Donald Trump just stole Xi Jinping's favorite foreign policy. And so how does that end?
But I think that's positive. I think we enable Xi Jinping in that regard. We enable him when we talk about thinking about invading Greenland, for access to it, for control over its, critical minerals and rare earth elements. To me, what we're doing is both diminishing the United States on the global stage and enabling China's vision.
While we're talking about invasion, let's talk about Ukraine, because I was in China for the whole of the beginning of the Ukraine war, and one of the most shocking things, to your point, Mike, about the cold chess playing analysis that China has of this. I remember very early on, the day after the Bucha massacre, that suburb of Kyiv, you all remember it very early on, going to see the foreign ministry for a bollocking, and the Bucha, our call for China to condemn this came up, and they said, if we condemned the Bucha massacre, would you lift the controls on semiconductors? Yeah. And I said, I think if you think we're going to pay you to condemn the massacre, you're misreading the mood right now. But that was their kind of mood. So China right now, I've heard a scholar, we maybe were at the same meeting.
We were at the same
There was a track 2 thing where a Chinese scholar said, Donald Trump's desire to re-engage with Vladimir Putin to bring Russia in from the cold is a fantastic opportunity for China, because all this nagging we've had for 3 years from the Europeans about being friends with Russia goes away. And I think there are Chinese officials and scholars and business leaders who figure that actually they could end up as winners from the Ukraine war, invited to rebuild Ukraine, bringing in the infrastructure, playing a role in the peace talks. Is that right? Is that where we are? Or do you think actually it's damaged them on balance? I'd love to ask all of you that.
Right. So the absolute best answer I've heard on this question was presented by Liz Economy from Stanford at a CFR event. So how about that?
There you go.
So she's good, apparently.
Yes.
I don't know what I said, but yay. Okay. What did I say, Jim?
You talked about how different scholars are contending over this very question about how close to bring Putin in, how much Russia is damaging Chinese reputation. And I think you concluded on balance that it was stay the course.
Mike?
You know, I think China's support for Russia and its invasion of Ukraine did fundamentally wake up Europe that China wasn't just an economic challenge, but potentially a national security challenge. And I think there was progress made. For years, the US and Europe did not see China the same way. And Europe was very reluctant to be dragged into a US vision for how to manage the economic challenges of China. I think we've gotten much, much closer. I think what's happened in the last 5 months, to be frank, is we've sort of let China off the hook because we've now driven Europe to say, okay, we really do need a third way. We can't be fully aligned with the United States. They're putting tariffs on us, and yet we know China remains a major economic challenge as well. So I think you're absolutely right in saying that I was absolutely right. That it really is China acting very much in its self-interest. I remember at the one stage I was briefly involved in the drawdown in Afghanistan, and the Chinese ambassador came in to see me and said, "Please don't pull your troops out of Afghanistan too quickly. We need them to protect our minds." And I said, that's the sort of thing that's a thought bubble, but not a say bubble. You're not actually supposed to say that. But you could very much see in Ukraine that they're going to play a significant, my guess of it is they're going to play a very significant role in the rebuilding of Ukraine because they can and they'll do so at a good price, and we will end up paying them for it.
So slightly different perspective, I think. I think the Europeans are a little bit stronger than maybe we might have given them credit for, in the sense that it's a little bit more like, yes, the United States sucks now, but it doesn't mean that China doesn't suck too, basically. And I think they recognize that China is still problematic. So the fact that we're doing what we're doing doesn't mean that they're turning toward China in a significant way. And so what I've seen coming out of the Europeans has been very much, don't expect to be there for the reconstruction, given your current support for Russia. In fact, I think the G7 came out with a statement to the effect that states that supported the invasion are not going to be part of, the reconstruction, are not going to have those benefits. So I've been pleased, frankly, with the strength of the European commitment and the tough actions and comments that they've made around China. So I don't think that they're going to bend.
Though, as you all know, in the capitals of Europe and certainly in Brussels, there is this lively debate. There are some people saying, we're scared of Trump, he's scary, he's awful, so maybe we should hedge by getting much closer to China. And I think that the most effective counter-argument is you've got risk from the Americans. How does embracing risk from China sort that out? I can quote a former foreign minister of Lithuania who I asked about this recently, who said, we have an expression in Russian that it's like freezing your ears off to spite your mother. So I offer that. Before we, I'll let you ponder that. It sounds better in the original Russian, perhaps. So before we go to the audience, because I'm sure we've got lots of great questions, I don't want to let you off the hook, Liz, because you were in charge of the small yard high fence in your role as China sort of supremo in the last administration. The DeepSeek moment. China unveils this astonishing technology success. It's not the only one. There are lots of voices saying, you see, export controls don't work. we only sort of incentivize China to innovate. What a kind of catastrophe. I maybe have a different view, but I'd just like to, before we go to the audience, just on this question of trying to limit American technology, American capital being used to help China get stronger in some ways, that kind of fundamental approach that we've seen for the last few years. Has it been a catastrophic failure?
I don't think it's been a catastrophic failure, and you can see right now the challenges that DeepSeek is having in terms of releasing, round 2. It's said that it basically can't do that in part because it doesn't have access to the NVIDIA chips that it needs. But yes, China has many workarounds. I mean, we've seen them, push forward on their innovation, which they were already doing. So, their indigenous innovation was already moving them in this direction, but has accelerated the process. They find, things they need, on the black market. They go through third countries to get what they need. So there are all sorts of workarounds. Frankly, I was I always argued in the Commerce Department that we needed to do a study of the efficacy of export controls, because as we were moving forward with them, I wanted to understand what is it we're trying to accomplish with them and what are we actually gaining. You know, is this a 6-month lead? Is this a 2-year lead? What do we think we're getting out of this? And are we actually getting that? I can't say that I was successful in that particular effort. But I think if you look at one of the final statements that my former boss, Secretary Raimondo, made when she left, she said, you know, it's not about trying to slow China down, it's about running faster. We're not going to be able to contain them. We've got to run faster. And to me, that's really the point, is that what are we doing to invest in ourselves, in our R&D, in our advanced manufacturing? How does the United States move ahead, not always looking behind, trying to trip China? You never win a race that way, right? The point is to run faster.
It was kind of taking the running shoes away from some of them, right? I mean, the export controls were a thing. But Mike, what's your sense of where this goes? Are we going to carry on down a road of ever tougher export controls, or is that changing?
Yeah, no, look, I agree with Dr. Economy here. I think it's been quite successful, and I think one data point of how successful it is that the Chinese are neuralgic about it. It's their number one issue, as you raised on, you know, the question about the massacre and coming out against it. It is the number one thing that they are upset about. They feel they can work their way around tariffs. Probably at some level it's more difficult, but they feel that tariffs are something they can digest. They can't digest the lack of access to technology, and as they will run as fast as they can, but it is very much having an effect. I think there's a question, not for this session, for another session. What does it mean to be 6 months or 2 years ahead, and does that matter if they ultimately get there? You know, what do you do with that 6-month period? Exactly. That's going to fundamentally transform the world, or is it just that we get to crow about the fact that we got there before they did? But if our goal is to stay ahead, it's got to be, I think, in part by denying them the most cutting-edge technology, and as Liz said, continuing to invest in innovation and making sure that we are running as fast as we possibly can.
And Jim, from your perch, looking at the kind of the effective and less effective tools of national security, what was your view of this sort of export control, technology limitation push?
We don't really understand how to do it, to Liz's point, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. The Chinese Communist Party regards the United States as an adversary, an enemy. That's the word they use. Why don't we? I'm all for hobbling an enemy, even if we're doing it imperfectly. I'm much more, though, about trying to improve our own stride. Again, we do not lack for advantage. We just need to exercise it.
Thank you so much. So let's go to the audience for questions. I think we have one mic. So, okay, so we have two people fortuitously sitting side by side. So we're going to take both questions here this time. So the gentleman with the sunglasses.
I'm curious, how realistic does the panel feel that China will invade Taiwan? And excluding the Trump administration, just a normal government, whether it be Republican or Democrat, how do you think the United States will react to that?
And we had a question here.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you whether you find that regulation at the global level would be a way to put together the US and Europe and to confront China in values-based policies.
Thank you. So panel, let's start with the Taiwan.
President Xi has said, General Secretary Xi, President is too much of an honorific, General Secretary Xi has said that he would like the capability by 2027. They're not going to make it. They're not going to be ready by 2027, in my view. That said, the Pentagon doesn't plan on probabilities. The Pentagon plans on what the president tells us to be ready to do, and we must be ready to defend Taiwan. And that's a monumental challenge, and we have a lot more work to do to get after it.
Mike, can I ask you as well, there's so much debate in Washington about whether Taiwan is an existential kind of national interest that even deserves to be defended. If you think that Taiwan is something that America has a vital interest in defending, can you make the case? How do you make that case?
So, like, I mean, I think there's been strong historic support for Taiwan as an important democracy in the region, as an independent entity, and as an important economic partner. I think what we've seen is I don't think President Trump necessarily fully buys into all of that, and I think folks who have been very strong on the importance of defending Taiwan have begun to weaken in the Congress, which is distressing to see. There's been talk about, President Trump's talked about wanting to do a grand bargain with with Xi. He believes he's got a good relationship with them. He believes he can negotiate something. There's talk about a fourth communique that would sort of solve the Taiwan issue. You know, I have a gut feeling, and I think nobody in the world believes me or agrees with me, except for maybe Dr. Economy. No, probably not. That part of this grand bargain, given how we now understand the president's both transactional and the transaction begins with economics, would be very happy to say to President Xi, of course we're not going to spill American blood for Taiwan. I mean, we have a trade deficit with them. We don't even like them. All we need is 50% of TSMC. And that would be a bargain I think President Xi would take in a heartbeat.
Liz?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't disagree with Mike. I'm quite concerned about what kind of deal President Trump might cook up. There has been, as you say, very strong support for Taiwan traditionally within the U.S. Congress. I mean, if you were to look at sort of the Hegseth, Waltz, and Rubio triumvirate, you would see, I think, strong support for Taiwan, but it seems almost meaningless looking at what the cabinet officials believe or want. It really is decision maker number one, what President Trump wants. I will hang my hat on what one still present member of the National Security Council told me when I asked him this question about whether President Trump would trade away Taiwan in some grand bargain. And he said, President Trump won't give Xi Jinping what he wants most. That's the only thing I can hope for. Last point I would make is that I think it doesn't have to be an invasion of Taiwan. Right, mainland could undertake some very serious cybersecurity action. They could do a blockade. There's a lot of other stuff that they could do that would seriously disrupt Taiwan, that could cause Taiwan over time to sort of fold. So I think we have to think about a range of different scenarios when we think about a problematic Taiwan, U.S.-China scenario.
And panel, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to take your question and enlarge it, if I may. So you had a kind of question about a potentially benevolent scenario in which America and the Europeans come together and realizing they have common values, and that forms into kind of norms and then regulation. I guess I'm going to expand that into, how does this end well? Is there a way that this US-China confrontation, the general sort of splitting of the West, how does this end well? Can I start with you, Jim? What's the best case scenario?
We've done quite a bit of work in internal work on the question. I'll say that the idea of a new Cold War appeals to me from its spirit of competitiveness, but has a lot of flaws in terms of China v. Russia. Economic interdependence requires a lot more subtlety than we could exercise with the Soviet Union. The notion of we win, they lose, to quote President Reagan, is obviously deeply appealing, but if that were to happen in the near term, it would be potentially catastrophic. Much of the world's economic growth is driven by China maintaining some sense of stability as an actor, and if they fell apart, perhaps civil war inside China, that would be very difficult for the world, global recession at least, and also I worry a little bit about loose nukes. The best answer would be eventually, over a much longer time period, some transmutation of the way the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese ruling class, regards itself and its duty to its citizens, in the same way that we saw, I don't know, Britain and France eventually give up after several hundred years of warfare and outright antagonism to come to the place they are now. The United States hasn't had a war plan against the United Kingdom since roughly 100 years. So could I imagine that future? Yes. Is it likely? No.
So Mike and Liz, I'm sorry, we've only got 2 minutes, but if I could ask each of you to take a minute each on a small question about how this ends well.
Look, I think the best case is that we end up with selective decoupling. So not complete decoupling, but we address those dependencies that we currently have that we view as unacceptable, and address them and come to some sort of agreement of what a sustainable economic relationship looks like, and what the strengths, or what the extent and limitations of that are. What I don't have a good sense of, and defer to the others, is what does this mean for China's ambitions in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, and other areas where we may be diametrically opposed.
And Liz?
I think the only way this ends well is if there is a significant, and I thought this is where you were going, Jim, significant transmutation in the leadership in China, and you end up, with a Taiwan, South Korea, Japan move from, authoritarianism to sort of a progression toward greater democracy. That, to me, is the only way that this ends well, because I don't think that selective decoupling addresses China's bigger ambitions.
So regime change.
We don't use that. We don't use that term
Generational
anymore.
change.
Peaceful evolution.
You heard it here first.
Generational change. I remember it's important how much generations matter in Chinese politics. Is that fair, Liz? I remember talking to a Chinese academic, very distinguished reformer, now broken-hearted, still has his job, exactly the same age as Xi Jinping. And he had had the same experience as Xi Jinping. He was sent down to the countryside, saw terrible, brutal acts, massacres, purges in his sort of teenage years. And he goes, we are damaged. My generation, we are the worst people. We are damaged and brutalized. And until we leave the scene, this country has no hope. So I think it's incredible how powerful that sort of personalization is. Panel, we could have answered so many more questions. I'm sorry to the audience for only getting to a couple, but thank you very much for covering a lot of ground.
Thank you.